It's my pleasure to welcome Frances Dinkelspiel to Story Hour. Frances is a fifth-generation Californian who grew up in San Francisco and studied history at Stanford. After studying journalism at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, she started her reporting career at the Syracuse newspapers in upstate New York and later moved to the San Jose Mercury News. As a freelancer, she's written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. She's also the founder of Berkeley Site, a news site about Berkeley, which has twice won the Best Community News Site award from the Northern California Society of Professional Journalists. In 2008, Frances published her first book, Towers of Gold: How One Jewish Immigrant Named Isaias Hellman Created California. As she grew up, Frances knew that her great-great-grandfather was somehow involved with the Wells Fargo Bank. Around 2000, she began rummaging through his files at the California Historical Society. And what she found was the extraordinary story of a man who arrived penniless in Los Angeles at the age of 16. And he made himself into a rich man and became the state's greatest financier in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, playing a role in building at least 7 industries that shaped California: transportation, oil, electricity, land development, water, wine, and education. The reviewer for the San Francisco Chronicle wrote that the book was a carefully researched and superbly written memoir. Dinkelspiel's biography brings to life the transformation of California into the state with the strongest economy in the nation. A marvelous resource, a dramatic slice of Western history, and a splendid read. In 2015, Frances published Tangled Vines, a book that begins with a massive fire breaking out in the Wine's central warehouse in Vallejo, California. By the time the fire was stopped a few hours later, it had destroyed 4.5 million bottles of California's finest wine, worth more than 250 million, making it the largest destruction of wine in history. The book becomes an investigation of the man who set the fire, a Berkeley-born, well-educated, world-traveling photographer who was himself a wine aficionado, whose love for wine actually led him to this crime. For me, the book was an essential education in the history of winemaking in California, and one with the narrative velocity of a very good novel. I completely agreed with the reviewer for the Los Angeles Book Review, who wrote, "From its explosive prologue to the very last sentence, Frances Dinkelspiel has written an utterly riveting true crime book. Unlike the wine collectors in Tangled Vines, I cannot taste the earth, the sun, the sky, and the steady hand of the winemaker in that glass, but I know a spectacular book when I read one." And it is a truly spectacular book. You should read it if you haven't. Please join me in welcoming Frances Dinkelspiel.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I appreciate it. I'm really happy to be here in the Morrison Library. This is one of my favorite rooms on the Cal campus. I'm sure you guys feel the same way. It's just spectacular. So it makes me feel at home here. I'm a real library rat. To do this book in Towers of Gold, I spent a lot of time in the Bancroft Library as well in the stacks of dough down there. And in fact, on the way here, I just returned some books. So I'm really happy to be here. So Tangled Vines, Greed, Murder, Obsession, and an Arsonist in the Vineyards of California is a story about fire and wine. As Vikram mentioned, it centers on a huge fire that erupted in a wine warehouse in Vallejo, California in October 2005. The warehouse was called Wine Central, and it held the wine of 90 different wineries and 40 different collectors. And it was about, a couple of football fields long and wide. It was a massive warehouse. And a fire erupted on an afternoon in October, right in the middle of harvest. And the fire grew so big, and the smoke that came out of the building that was so dark, that a Vallejo firefighter said it looked as if a 747 had crashed into the building. And when the Vallejo Fire Department finally put the fire out, 4.5 million bottles of fine California wine worth $250 million had been completely destroyed. And it was a really cataclysmic event for the California wine industry at the time, because a lot of winemakers had all of their product that they were poised to sell completely destroyed. And wine, of course, is a seasonal crop. So if you lose one vintage, you've lost that vintage. You can't go back and remake it. So it was a time of economic hardship for a lot of winemakers, and it took a couple years for the wine industry to really get back on its feet. Now, the fire happened in 2005, and I heard about it a little bit because I was writing a book on Isaias Hellman, my great-great-grandfather. And as it turned out, my cousin, a woman named Miranda Heller, had put about 175 bottles of wine made by Isaias Hellman in 1875 from a vineyard in Southern California in that warehouse. And it was completely destroyed. And she told me about it, and I put a little footnote in Towers of Gold about it. But I didn't really think much about the wine that was lost. I mean, it wasn't my wine, and I moved on. I had other things to do. In 2009, I was freelancing for the New York Times. It had this local section for a while. And I noticed that a trial was coming up for the man who'd been accused of setting the fire, a man named Mark Anderson. And I pitched a story to the editor of that local section, asking her if I could write about the fire. And she said, go ahead. And the very first thing I did was I called my cousin Miranda Heller, and I asked her what it felt like to lose all that wine. I am a hard-hitting reporter. I'm not above trying to probe my relatives for their feelings. And Miranda told me that she was very upset, obviously, about the fire and the wine that had been lost, because she felt she was a steward of this wine. This was a family heirloom on some level, and under her watch, it had gotten destroyed. So I was really happy about that. I knew I was going to incorporate Miranda in my story. But before my story came out, I was sitting at my desk in my office in Berkeley, and the phone rang. And I picked it up, and there was an automated voice on the other end of the line asking if I would accept a collect call from Sacramento County Jail from a man named Mark Anderson, the man who was about to go on trial. And what could I say, right? I said, yes, I'll accept this call. But before Mark and I could connect, the phone went dead. So I hastily wrote him a letter and sent it off to the jail. And my article came out, and almost immediately I got a letter back from Mark thanking me for my article, because I had bothered to interview one of his cousins who talked about how Mark had a good sense of humor, and I put that in the story. And Mark was very appreciative that someone had written something positive about him. Anyway, that one exchange of letters was the beginning of a 3-year, rather bizarre relationship I developed with Mark Anderson, in which we exchanged many, many letters. I went to visit him in jail. I went to his court hearings, and I began to try to find out as much as I could about Mark, because I thought, well, this is really interesting. I want to see where it goes. And I, however, never really told Mark about the fact that my family had a connection with the fire. Miranda Heller made it into the lead of my story, but I never told Mark that Miranda was my cousin. I felt like I just didn't want to reveal that to him. So what I thought I would do today was talk to you a little bit about Mark and read to you some of my interactions with him, and talk to you about how a writer makes an unsympathetic character the main part of a book. It goes completely against what you're told when you're learning about writing. You need a sympathetic character people can relate to. Well, I had a problem because the main person in my book was a criminal, a con man, and an arsonist. And yet I knew I had to have him at the center of my book. So it was sort of a lot of dancing around in order to try to make this man both interesting and somewhat approachable, and also sort of reveal what had prompted him to set this fire that was so destructive. So what I thought I'd do is I just read from the prologue of my book about when I first go to meet Mark Anderson. So one thing I want to tell you before I start is Mark is a very large man. He weighs about 300 pounds. Mark Anderson was wearing prison orange, not black, when I looked at him through the glass of the jail's visiting room window. Under the glare of a harsh fluorescent light, his skin was sallow and his once luxurious blonde ponytail had turned an undistinguished gray. Anderson was sitting down, so I couldn't see his enormous girth, but the jowls around his face hinted at his size. Anderson's manner was mild and his face almost cherubic, but, as I would soon learn, that openness was deceptive. He didn't care anything about others. He was the kind of man who thought and talked only about himself. Anderson had asked me to the Sacramento County Jail to prove his innocence. He had been accused of a heinous crime, one that cost the California economy hundreds of millions of dollars. There was plenty of evidence to suggest that he was guilty, but Anderson had been spinning tales about his life for so long he never knew when to stop. Maybe this reporter would believe his version of events, would take the clues he hinted at and go out and uncover the government conspiracy he was sure was after him. We only had 20 minutes to talk. I didn't have either pen or paper, as I had been ordered to leave my purse in a locker after I had shown my driver's license to a sheriff's deputy ensconced behind bulletproof glass. I then joined a long line of women and their children, mostly Mexican or black, who were waiting to see loved ones too poor to make bail. How do you cram months' worth of questions into a few minutes? How do you steer a man you have never met into a conversation about what might have motivated his crime when he has no intention of admitting anything? Even though I had spent years writing about gruesome murders, cheating husbands, and shady politicians, when I sat across from Mark Anderson, I found I couldn't pounce with the hard questions when I needed to. I didn't have any true killer instinct, it turned out. Instead, Mark and I had a conversation that wouldn't have been out of place around a nice dinner and a glass of wine. Of course, it being Mark, who fancied himself a wine connoisseur, the wine would have to be an old Bordeaux or a hard-to-find Burgundy. I inquired about his living conditions. He described them in detail. I asked about his health. He went on to explain his various physical ailments. He had a back so contorted he spent many hours of each day lying on the ground. He was recovering from prostate cancer. He had sleep apnea. According to him, the jail was, quote, a pit akin to a prison ship in the 1600s, a reference, it seemed, designed to impress me with his erudition. From there, our conversation meandered to his travels in France, the incompetence of his lawyer, and how I really should track down this particular lead. His role in the crime barely came up. That was my first time I met Mark face to face, and as I sort of alluded to earlier, I wasn't really forthright with him. I told him I was maybe going to write a magazine article or a book about the fire, but I never sort of said, yes, my family had a stake in this. And it's interesting that I omitted that because one of the driving reasons I decided to write the book was I soon began to think a lot about those bottles of wine that had been lost, those bottles made in 1875. And, wine is meant to be consumed. It's meant to be drunk with friends. So I had to ask myself, did it really matter if the wine was burnt up instead? I mean, it was going to disappear at one point anyway. And I started to think a lot about what went into the making of that wine and how hard it had been, and wanting to know why that wine had lasted such a long time. It was 130 years old. How does wine last that long? And I should say here that the wine was actually a fortified wine. It was a port. That was the way a lot of early California wine was made. I went on and I ended up having sort of this dual track to write this book. On one hand, I had the story of the crime in Mark Anderson, and the other path that I was following was trying to figure out the history of these bottles of wine that had been destroyed and trying to find out, how the wine was made. And what I ended up finding out was that the wine was made in a place called Rancho Cucamonga on a vineyard called Cucamonga Vineyard, and it was about 580 acres. And interestingly enough, that vineyard actually reflected not only the history of wine in California, but the history of California. It turned out that there were 5 murders associated with that particular vineyard. There were racial tensions that erupted. There were land grabs. Monopoly owned that land. And it turned out that that small little section of land that my great-great-grandfather acquired in 1870 really had this very rich history. And I try to explain it in the book. I want to go back to the question about how to make a criminal kind of an interesting character. I mean, Mark was born in Berkeley in 1948. He came from a family who'd been here for a while. He was middle class. He grew up on Brookside Avenue right off of Claremont. He went to John Muir Elementary School. He went to UC Berkeley. And then he went to a lot of other schools. When he was a teenager, he found his way to Sausalito, where he built houseboats for a living. And then he sort of drifted here and there. He went to Japan and Hong Kong for a long time. But he found his way back to Sausalito, where he never really established himself very strongly in business. He was a photographer, but he became a civic citizen anyway. He was involved with the Rotary Club. He was at the Chamber of Commerce. And he wrote articles and columns for the local newspapers. And he became very well known, actually for a very funny reason, which is something I describe in this book. And I think this is a good reflection of trying to, how do you make a man both sympathetic and a little bit repulsive at the same time? So I'm going to read you another section about Mark Anderson. And as I explained, he was in the Rotary Club, he was involved in the Sister City Commission, et cetera, et cetera. Anderson's fame stemmed from his patronage of Sushi Ron, a Japanese restaurant on a small street on the edge of Sausalito's downtown. Sushi Ron had sort of sneaked up on the residents of Sausalito. For years, the top restaurant in town had been the Trident, a Bayside restaurant started by the music group the Kingston Trios in the 1960s. The Trident had tapped into the cultural zeitgeist with its natural food and creative cocktails, and had attracted celebrities like Janis Joplin, Jerry Garcia, and Joan Baez. The Trident got really famous when concert promoter Bill Graham threw 2 private parties for the Rolling Stones there in the early 1970s. Yoshi Tomei took over a nondescript Japanese place in 1986 with the goal of transforming it into a top-notch restaurant that would attract politicians, business people, and Sausalito's artists, so often that they would come to regard Sushi Ron as a second home. Tomei hit upon the idea of launching the Sushi Lovers Club with a hall of fame for the most loyal patrons. Those who racked up dozens of visits could have their photos prominently displayed on the restaurant's front wall. From the start, the Sushi Lovers Club was a hit. People who might have visited just a few times a year started coming frequently. They wanted to see their photo on a wall. The competition was unbelievable, said Tomei. It helped that Tomei had brought in a talented chef. The food earned glowing reviews with 3 stars from the San Francisco Chronicle, and it was anointed one of the best restaurants in the Bay Area by both Michelin and Zagat. Anderson soon became a regular, often walking the 4 blocks from his apartment to the Rand for lunch. His favorite dish was ten-tama soba, buckwheat soba noodle soup with a raw egg cracked over the broth, and a few pieces of shrimp tempura piled on top. He often stopped by late at night as well to drink wine or sake and share gossip with Tomei at the bar. The pair became close friends. Many people still carry images in their head of Anderson at Sushi Ron, laughing, telling jokes, hanging out with Sausalito's politicians and civic leaders. All those visits earned Anderson a spot on the Sushi Lovers Hall of Fame. His photo first went up in 1987 after he'd made 100 visits, the 4th most of any customer. In 1994, he won the #1 spot, visiting 211 times. He won again in 1996 after visiting 195 times. His biggest competitors were his friends, other food-oriented people like Jack Rubin, the chair of the Marin Food and Wine Society. In 1995, Rubin took the #1 spot after he ate at Sushi Ron 458 times. This became a ridiculous competition. Anderson came in second that year, eating at the restaurant 192 times. Altogether, Anderson ate at Sushi Ron more than 2,000 times. Mark turned it into an absurd competition, said Tom Stern, a Sausalito journalist. He would go there every day. For 3 years, he had more than 365 visits. He wanted to be number one. He would go there and order a glass of wine, and that would count as a visit. All that eating and drinking took a toll. Anderson was in his late 30s and slim and strong from playing tennis and other sports when he first visited the restaurant. Over the years, he ballooned to more than 300 pounds. It's funny what having your photo on the wall of a popular restaurant can do. That's what people would remember Mark Anderson for years later, after news broke that he was charged with wine theft and arson. Anderson may have been lauded by the Sausalito mayor for his civic involvement and the columns he started to write for the region's big weekly, the Marin Scope, but it was his Sushi Ron meals that won him the most attention. So this was, I think, a good reflection of a man who is obsessed, who gets obsessed about things. And he got obsessed about sushi, and he also got obsessed about wine. And in those letters that we exchanged back and forth, he told me about these incredible tales about he went to Japan and he came upon a group of older, wealthy Japanese businessmen who had formed something called the Kansai Club. And it was a wine tasting society, and they flew all over the world to taste wine. So Mark said he had gone to the Great Pyramid of Egypt to have wine. He'd gone to an atoll in the South Pacific to have wine for New Year's Eve. He'd gone to, the hotel in Paris, I think it's the Jour 5, and had a vertical of fantastic Bordeaux. I mean, he described himself having this, the most amazing experiences with wine. And obviously, wine for Mark was something that made him feel good. I mean, wine makes all of us feel good, doesn't it? I mean, you drink a little bit and you feel a little rosy and toasty and cheerful. But it also, I think, made him feel more important. As I said, he didn't have the greatest business sense. So Mark, in 1999, he decided he was going to capitalize on his love of wine, and he was going to open a wine storage business. And he did that in Sausalito. He opened up a place where people could go and leave their wine in temperature-controlled facilities. And this was sort of really at an early time when people were just starting to collect wine a little bit crazily. And so Mark almost had a market to himself. He threw up this website that talked about his Sausalito cellars. He said it had computerized inventory, that no one had access to the wine except for the owner. He really sort of made a website that talked about what a sophisticated operation he had. Well, it turned out that it was not at all a sophisticated operation. After a short period of time, Mark Anderson discovered that he could make a lot more money selling his clients wine rather than just charging them rent. And this book, Tangled Vines, it has a lot to say about the dark side of the wine industry. And as it turns out, wine is not a very closely regulated industry. So when Mark went to sell, it wasn't that hard for him to sell bottles of his clients' wine. He could put some stuff up on the internet, or he could go to other places that sold wine on the internet. And one of his favorite places to go was a store called Premier Cru. And I don't know how many of you have been following what's been going on with Premier Cru. It was in Emeryville at the time. It later moved to Berkeley. And a guy named John Fox ran it. And Mark would drive up in his burgundy Cadillac with milk crates in the back with loose bottles of wine, and he would show it to John Fox, who would write him a check and then go sell the wine. Fox didn't ask if Mark had the right to buy this wine. He didn't ask for any verification or anything. And this is how loose it was in that period. And so Mark managed to sell more than 1 million bottles of his client's wine. And at first, nobody noticed because it was, people go and they store their wine and they don't expect to, take it out on a regular basis. But finally, one restaurateur asked for his wine back, and Mark made a lot of excuses. There was no wine, and that prompted the Sausalito police to launch an investigation. So I want to just read to you another scene about what happened to one person when they found out about that their wine was gone. And it shows you how passionate people are about wine, because people who love wine really, really love wine. So the year 2005 was annus horribilis for Anderson. Ron Lussier, who had been renting space for Anderson for almost 4 years, heard about the embezzlement charges in January. Lussier called Anderson, who downplayed the situation. Everything was a mix-up, Anderson said. The guy who was complaining hadn't delivered the amount of wine he was now claiming. Lussier didn't care. At that point, he wanted out. He and his boyfriend were building a wine cellar in their Sausalito home and that could accommodate their wine. Anderson told Lussier that he could get his wine, but he would have to wait a week. It was only then that Anderson revealed that Lussier's wine was in Vallejo, not Sausalito. Anderson gave a meandering explanation that he was forced to move the wine because of the unexpected and unresolvable cooling problems in the Sausalito facility. A week later, Lussier drove in a rented truck to Wine Central. He expected to spend a few hours with Anderson cleaning out his collection and was surprised when Anderson departed, leaving an employee to move Lussier's 30 cases of wine. Lussier had poured his heart and soul into that collection. In addition to tracking down Sine Qua Non bottle by bottle, that's a cult wine that comes from Santa Barbara that Lussier really liked. Lussier had purchased great California Cabernet Sauvignon from top wineries like Silver Oak in the Oakville portion of Napa and Stag's Leap. Every time he made a wine purchase, Lussier thought about the parties he would host for his friends, creating memorable evenings with good food, good wine, and good cheer. When Lussier returned to his hillside home in Sausalito, he took inventory. It looked like Anderson had returned all his cases. He selected a wooden box that held wines made by Stag Leap's Vineyard from 1992 to 1998. He tried to take off the top. It wouldn't budge. It was glued shut. That was odd. Lussier thought to himself. Lussier got a lever and pried open the top. He was shocked by what lay inside. Instead of 6 beautiful bottles of Cabernet Sauvignon made from some of Napa's finest vineyards, worth about $650 each, there were 6 bottles of 2 Buck Chuck from Trader Joe's. The price for each bottle, less than $2. It was painful, said Lussier. When we bought it, we thought we would have a fantastic party one day. We were going to taste it to see how it changed every year. Lussier called Anderson on the phone and demanded an explanation. Anderson delivered his usual litany of excuses and suggested the wine must have been misplaced when Sausalito Cellars moved to Wine Central in Vallejo. The rest of the wine never showed up, said Lussier. Mark would always mumble excuses, kind of like street people. He would mumble. He would just go on and on and on. He seemed to put on an endless stream of ever-changing excuses. Lussier went to the police. I detail a couple of people who were hoodwinked by Mark, and eventually the pressure got to be so great on Mark that he realized he had to do something. He was facing about 10 embezzlement charges, and he was facing the loss of face in Sausalito. He had been known as the man who was the civic citizen, and he would go to affairs, and he would be the kind of guy who would always bring a great bottle of wine. Where did he get that wine? Well, probably from his clients. But all of a sudden, he was about to be exposed as a thief. So he concocted this idea that he wanted to cover his tracks. And he had the notion that if he set fire to this wine warehouse, and the wine burned, the police would no longer be able to say that he had sold the wine to Premier Clue and other places. And Mark would be able to say that the wine burnt up and that they had no proof that he had sold it. So in this hot day in October, he went and he soaked some rags in gasoline. He put them in a bucket. He got a plumber's torch. He put the bucket in a duffel bag, and he went upstairs to the mezzanine area of the wine warehouse, where he had over the weeks been sorting his wine, and he had a huge collection of wooden crates and styrofoam and things like that, very flammable material. And he dumped out the rags, and he set the plumber's torch, and it caught on fire. And at that point, Mark ran out of the warehouse as fast as he could. And as I mentioned, he's a 300-pound person, and he had to pass through the office on his way out. And the manager of the office said she'd never seen Mark Anderson running as fast as that in her life before. Well, about 20 minutes later, all hell broke loose, and the wine warehouse completely burnt up. And fortunately, the people who were inside were able to get out. And Mark was not arrested for this crime for 2 years, and then he was sentenced in 2009. I just want to take a tiny little detour. I'm kind of almost running out of time to just talk a little bit about the history and writing history, which is very different. Like all the writing that I've been describing is really crime reporting. It's something I've done a lot as a journalist. But I really also love writing history. I love poring through documents, reading diaries, reading old newspaper accounts, looking at photographs, and trying to use all those elements in order to create a scene of a bygone era. And I mentioned I spent a lot of time in the Bancroft Library here, which has such a great collection of things. And I found a bunch of things that enabled me to do that. And I just want to read one short excerpt about a historical section. So this is completely incongruous with what I was reading from you before. But I just history is a big part of this book. So the Cucamonga vineyard, where the wine that burnt up came from, turned into be a very famous vineyard in its time. It made sort of sweet wine. Some of it was fortified. Some of it was a white wine called Angelica. And so I was trying to show how it was a special wine. So this is just a small section that I think might convey how I tried to create the history. The travelers couldn't believe the sight before them. For 3 months, they'd been trekking across deserts and mountains, exhausted and half-starved. They had killed off their horses and mules one by one and stuck their heads in tiny pockets in the ground to drink up drops of moisture. The plan, to take the southern route to the California gold fields, had seemed like a good idea when they left Provo, Utah, 3 months earlier. Now it was Christmas Day in 1849, and the 25 would-be gold miners were nearly spent, their clothes in rags, their boots worn down, their spirits low. They had come out of the mountains hours earlier and had made their way to Rancho Cucamonga, a welcoming spot of green after days in the desert. They thought the place was called the Pocamonga Ranch. The men were still about 500 miles from the gold mines, but the sight that greeted them, the first sign of civilization they had seen in months, promised riches of another kind. 2 naked Indians stood on a platform made from a cowhide stretched between 4 poles. In the center sat a pile of fermenting grapes. The Indians trod up and down, squishing the grapes into a bright red liquid that flowed out of a hole in the bottom of the hide. The travelers grabbed their tin cups and filled them with the young wine as the superintendent of the rancho, a dark-skinned man, looked on with amusement. Quote, "We went at the wine, caught it in our tin cups as we all had one apiece," one traveler noted in his diary. "We drank it as fast as the Indians could trample it for a while." The old Negro, after a while, said, "Gentlemen, you have had a hard time of it, I know, but the first thing you know, you will know nothing. You are welcome to it." The travelers drank draught after draught of the young wine until they collapsed on the ground in a stupor. They fell asleep right where they lay. Quote, "Now this spree was on Christmas Day. In the morning when we all got up, we felt pretty good, but awfully hungry." The travelers hadn't hit the gold fields yet, but they had stumbled upon what would one day be another of the state's riches, purple gold. Rancho Cucamonga was the first settled place many gold seekers taking a southern route into the mines would find as they came out of the mountains. It became a regular stop, and word spread that the wine from the vineyard was worth seeking out. So I had a lot of fun interspersing the history with the crime, and of course the connecting material is me. I talk about how I meet Mark Anderson. I talk about how I go to Rancho Cucamonga on this quest to understand what was lost. And in the end, I do open a bottle of this port from 1875, and I drink it with one of the world's most decorated wine tasters, and he delivers a verdict on how good the wine was and what's lost. And I won't tell you what happened there. That's the sort of the surprise at the end of my book. But I just want to finish up with one thing to say. So Mark, when I first encountered him in 2009, he had pleaded guilty to his crime. And I went to court to see him, and the prosecution suggested he get 15 years, 8 months in jail. And a couple months later, Mark decided to withdraw his guilty plea. And that set in motion a whole series of delays that took up a couple years. And Mark said that his attorney was a crummy attorney and had forced him to plead guilty, and he asked for a new attorney. And the federal judge overseeing the case finally decided to get Mark a new attorney and let his original attorney be released from attorney-client privilege. And that turned out to be the best thing that happened to me as a writer, because the attorney was so mad that Mark was besmirching his name, that he released into the public records all of Mark's psychiatric evaluations. So here I had this guy who I knew was strange, but then all of a sudden I had this psychiatric analysis of how he was really a narcissist. And I just remember the moment when I read that. I thought, oh, whippy-doo, this is fantastic. Anyway, just to wrap up, the judge finally ruled that Mark was not allowed to withdraw his guilty plea, and that was in 2012. So that was 7 years after the fire had been set, and a lot of people had been, waiting and waiting and waiting. And the day came to sentence Mark, and the judge was up there saying, "I can't believe the day has come." And he started this little soliloquy about, wine was lost. Everybody who makes wine thinks their bottle's worth $10,000. And it looked like he was not going to sentence Mark to a very long sentence, when all of a sudden this man named Ted Hall got up. And Ted Hall was a former head of McKinsey Associates. He is on the board of the San Francisco Symphony. He's a big winemaker. He was the man who took over the Mondavi Corporation after it imploded and steered it to its sale to Constellation, a big multinational company. And Ted got up, and he's this imposing man in a suit. And he goes up to the podium holding his speech. And before he can say anything, he bursts into tears. And he tells the judge how devastating this fire had been for him and how he had lost a couple of vintages. He had 19 workers. He didn't know how he was going to keep them. They resorted to making grappa in order to, get some money into the winery. And he talked about how devastating this fire was. And I was watching the judge when this happened, and you could just see the judge's face completely change from sort of one of skepticism about the severity of this crime, even though it was a $250 million crime, to really seeing what it meant. And after Ted sat down, the judge told Mark Anderson to stand up, and Mark did. And the judge said, "Well, I'm not going to sentence you to 15 years, 8 months, like you had, we'd worked out when you first pleaded guilty. But because you've manipulated the court so much, I'm going to sentence you to 27 years in prison." So he did that. Mark was sent off to Terminal Island Prison, where he still sits today. He was in his mid-60s when he was sentenced. He's not in great health, so it's probably unlikely that he'll ever get out of prison. But I think it was a just ending to this terrible, terrible fire that he set. So I'm going to end it here. I want to thank you so much for having me talk to you. And I can answer some questions if people have any questions about Tangled Vines or Towers of Gold. So thank you.
I have a logistical question. How do you keep track of these hundreds of facts that you...
Right. How do I keep track of these hundreds of facts? Well, that's a really good question. When I wrote my first book, was all on paper, and the search engines weren't that good, and I didn't do a lot of internet research. With Tangled Vines, I could do a lot more stuff on the computer, and I would, cut and paste into Google Docs a lot. I created all sorts of different lists that I kept in Google Docs, people who knew Mark, business associates, characterizations, and things like that. But now I'm on to using Evernote and Dropbox and other things. I mean, it is very, very hard because you forget what material you have out there. But it is also easier because with the computer you can do search terms and find things like that. So, yes?
In order to develop a sympathetic character out of a conniving thief, did you have any models that you?
So, yeah, I'll tell you one model I had, and I did. So Walter Kern, who came here to speak, the question is, in looking to create a sympathetic character that was really a conniving thief, did I have any models? And I was very influenced by Walter Kern's book about Clark Rockefeller, and he spoke at the Story Hour a couple years ago. It was a story, he met a man who said it was a Rockefeller, and he turned out to be a murderer and a con man. And the reason that book was so helpful to me was that he just sort of, admitted that he had been conned by this guy, and that trying to seek truth from a liar is an impossible task. And that I found really helpful because I was trying to seek Mark's truth. But, every time I tried to verify a fact, like, can I talk to your Japanese friends who, took you to the Great Pyramids? He would say, oh, they're all dead. Or he would say, I'd ask for, reference. Well, I don't have their email address. So all of these are clues for a writer and a journalist that he's not telling the truth. So I finally decided I was just going to present Mark's version of facts, but try to express my skepticism. And one of the things I found that was really helpful also was Mark had a younger brother, a guy named Stephen, who apparently hated Mark. And Stephen set up a number of websites in which he put up very bad poetry about how awful his brother was. And so I had heard about these websites, and I looked for them. I couldn't find them until I went to the Wayback Machine, which is I don't know what to call it. It's something that the Internet Archive does, where it takes snapshots of the internet. And it's a very helpful tool for reporters and researchers. And through the Wayback Machine, I was able to find some of these poems that Stephen had written about his brother. And they were all the negative things that I suspected, so I was able to put that in. Anyway, so I guess I sort of had a model, but not a complete model. So, yes?
Do you know if Mr. Henderson read the book and what reaction he had if he did?
So the question is, did Mark Anderson read my book? So Mark and I were exchanging letters. In January 2013, he was sent to Terminal Island Prison. And federal prisoners are allowed to use email. And one day I was looking through my junk mail, and I had an email from Mark asking if I would be his prison correspondent. And I looked at it, and the offer was only good for 10 days. And this was the 10th day. And so I answered back, yes, I'd like to be your prison correspondent. But I never heard from Mark after that, so I don't know if it expired or what. So after the book came out, a reporter from the Sausalito newspaper called Mark up to ask him about the book. And, I had talked about how Mark had manipulated the court system and had infuriated the federal judge. Well, after he had been convicted, he had appealed his conviction to the Court of Appeals. And it was ultimately denied. And I actually was under agreement with the ATF not to publish the book until Mark's legal, machinations had finished. So supposedly they're all finished. So anyway, this reporter contacts Mark Anderson and says, Mark, would you like to comment about this book? And he made a remark that I think sort of expressed how self-deluded he is. Mark said, no, I do not want to comment on Francis's book because I still have the hopes that the U.S. Supreme Court will take my case, and I don't want it to be tried in the court of public opinion. So that's the last I ever heard of Mark. So anyway. All right. Well, okay, one more.
Perhaps an anecdote sitting next to you, Marilyn. not a question, but an incidental comment. Sushi Run, if you go back farther, is the dental office that I've gone to, for 15 years. Never ate at Sushi Run.
Well, Sushi Ron is still a really good restaurant. I'd recommend it. And it was great. I got its owner to talk to me because he felt his Sushi Lovers Club had given Mark some validation in the community that he might not otherwise have received, and he used that validation to open his wine storage business. So in a very interesting way, he felt responsible for Mark's crime, which of course he wasn't. But Sausalito is a small community, just like Berkeley. Everybody sort of interacts together. So. Anyway, I think my time is up. I brought some books if people are interested in looking at them or buying them, and I'll sign books. And I just want to say thank you, Vikram, for having me. I love being in the Morrison Library, so thank you.